Okay, so we're just past the top of the hour here, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today on this Metric Insights webinar, where we're going to be covering BI ops, and we'll explain what we mean by all of that. My name's Mike Smitherman. I look after sales and marketing over here at Metric Insights, and once again, I've got my partner in crime, Marius, on the call. So hey, Marius, how you
Hello,
doing,
Mike.
dude?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
So yeah, we're going to be, the usual sort of show and tell of going through some slides and laying out some background to the topic here, and then we'll jump into some demo stuff. As always, we're recording this, so we will send out a link to the recording afterwards. Feel free to share that around. Open to Q&A and chat during the session. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to pop them into the chat window or the Q&A window. We'll keep an eye on that, either answer them as we're going along or get to them at the end. I think that's all the housekeeping. So with that, I'll hand it over to Marius, who'll get kicked off here.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone for joining us. And today we're going to talk about BI ops and really how do you make governed BI work. When it comes to governance, everyone really talks a good game. Right. If you look, almost every organization has a governance program. I think it's a data governance is, depending upon who you ask, is either $3.5 or $4 billion industry. So, lots of investment going into those areas, and people are doing all kinds of activities here. They're doing, you're getting glossary terms together, your definitions, you collecting lineage, you're identifying PII data, you're certifying data sets. There are lots of organizations that are doing a lot of work, and kind of saying that they're really focusing on governance. But in reality, if you look at it, and I will kind of make a case for that in this presentation, there's there's it falls flat. It falls really short of what it needs to do in order to have impact in an organization. And that's the key thing. I mean, we speak to so many different organizations, and they all tell us that, the ROI they're getting from their governance efforts are just not what they expected. And even measured by reach, how many users within the organization are interacting with this wealth of information that's being collected in their data governance platforms. It's not where it needs to be. It tends to be very few people as opposed to the rest of the organization. And then the BI environments in most organizations are just a complete mess. So we'll talk a lot about that and how do we really solve for that problem? What are the things that we need to change in the way that we approach governance and BI ops in particular to make a dent in this pretty pervasive problem across the industry. So kind of taking a step back, if you like, and thinking about data governance for a moment, I think one of the fundamental disconnects is that when people think about data governance, they just think about governing data. So in that context, it makes sense that you've got a data catalog, and in there you're capturing what data, where their PI data exists. Maybe you're identifying which data sets are good and should be used. Things maybe you're putting in definitions, and so maybe you're doing data quality. So you're really working around everything around your data, with your data as the center of your universe. But really, data governance should have people or users at its center, because at the end of the day, it's not really just about governing data. It's more about governing how people use the data. That is, what are you putting in place within your organization to make sure that everyone in the organization that's using the information, whether they be an analyst or a regular user just consuming something through a dashboard, that they're using data in the right way, right? And what, let's unwrap that a bit. What do we mean by that? So what, if you think about, take a step back and think about what would be the goals of data governance sort of at a abstract level, at a high level, right? What would you want? What would be considered successful in most organizations? Well, I would maintain that there are really three things at a high level. You want everyone in the organization that's consuming data, no matter how they're consuming it, to consume the right data, which means that they're looking at the right data set, they're looking at the right visualization, They're not looking at something that's obsolete. They're not looking at data that is somebody created that isn't really the good source of truth for the information. They're using the correct information. They're consuming it with context, right? So it's not enough to look at the right data or look at the right visualization, but you want the context that tells the user two things. One, what are the key definitions, KPIs? What are the key attributes about that data from a metadata perspective that tell me what I'm looking at? So, if I'm looking at something about customers, how's the customer defined and how's revenue defined in this report? If it's a revenue report, does it include direct and channel revenue or just direct revenue? And so on and so forth, right? So understanding what it is that I'm looking at, how numbers are counted, is incredibly important. And so that's sort of contextual information. And of course, I also want to know the things about, is the data good, right? So do I have data quality issues right now with this data? Because that gives me context. I might be looking at data that is in fact correctly defined, but today's ETL process is 3 hours late, or we had a problem, we only loaded half the records. Well, there's probably a problem. I should not be looking at that data without the knowledge that it does not include today's information. It's obsolete, right? So right context, vitally important. And then finally, from a governance perspective, you want to make sure that everybody is consuming this information in compliance with security policies. So that could mean that if I am an executive looking at restricted information, I need to know that this report contains restricted information so that I don't go ahead and share it with somebody on my team who is not supposed to be able to see it, because that's going to violate some SEC rules around consumption of data. If it's confidential and should be internal only, then I need to know that, because I want to make sure I don't share that information with a partner or somebody externally that I'm working with, and so on and so forth, right? So I need to know, make sure that I've got all the information that I need as a consumer so that I do not violate the security policies of the organization in the way that I use that data. The trouble is, fundamentally, is that all the data governance efforts that are happening today in your organizations, they tend to be half measures, right? Why are they half measures? Well, they're focused on the data, what's in the catalog. They're focused on identifying all that there, and they stop there. Whereas the majority, 90% plus of the users in your organization are consuming those analytics directly through dashboards, through reports, often through many different types of reports. And that consumption model does not feed into that governance layer effectively. So you don't actually have all that wealth of information at the point of consumption. And what's even worse is the actual reports that are being consumed. Oftentimes, it's a completely messy, cluttered, ungoverned environment in many ways. Sure, there's security applied, but when I see most in most organizations, if you go into your Power BI or Tableau environment, if it's been around for a while, there's a whole bunch of like duplicative content and things that are like two different reports that look almost identical, but they're not exactly the same because two different people in the organization created it. There's obsolete content. Some analysts built something 6 months ago, left the organization, and nobody's quite sure exactly who's using it and how. So it sort of continues to be there, even though it's really doesn't have the right definitions relative to how the companies define business terms and logic recently. All of that kind of stuff exists today across all the different reporting tools that are out there. And that creates a huge challenge as far as how do you create a governed experience for your users? Right? And that's the crux of the issue. And that's why when I said at the beginning, when I said that it's plainly obvious that the data governance investments are not really paying off. This is the reason why, is that they're half measures. They're not going all the way to the point of consumption, and they're not creating an environment where people have a governed set of analytics across which they're using a governed set of data. So now we've talked about the problem. Let's talk a little bit about the solution, right? And obviously, if there's a mess, then the first part of it is to clean it up, right? How do you make sure that you take that universe of, in many organizations, thousands of reports that have all this obsolete duplicative content in there? How do you work through that process to identify what should be kept and what should be presented to users? So that's the critical sort of first step. And then how do you make sure over time that it continues to be a clean environment? And the way I like to think of this is, one analogy is if any of you have done in the sort of gardening, right? But there's the idea of if you have or even it's just a flower bed and you plant some nice flowers, or you plant a vegetable garden, whatever you decide to plant. Yeah, if after some time, if you haven't done sort of grooming of that, then it's going to just become this overgrown mess of weeds, right? That's just you have, and as long as you're doing grooming on an ongoing basis, then it stays clean. And so we'll talk about not only how do you clean it up, how do you make sure everything is cleanly planted to start with, but how do you make sure over time that continues to be a clean environment in a way that is sort of sustainable within your organization. So step one, of course, is to understand what is there within your BI tools. And to understand that, you need to look at BI metadata, right? And BI metadata breaks down into a number of different components. So of course, there's the core reporting metadata. So, who's the owner of report? What's the name? What's the description? The things of that nature. If there's tagging on the reports, things of that, all that is core reporting metadata. But I understand what you have. You also have to look at report column metadata. So this says, if I've got a particular report, which are the columns that it's surfacing up and showing to the users? And this has customer name and sales amount and so on and so forth. Like these are the columns that are showing up in the dashboards that the users are looking at. Then in addition to that, you need to look at lineage information. So lineage information is critical because it tells you where the report is getting its information. So if I've got, customer information coming in one report and it's being presented, and there's another report also showing customer information, but it's coming from someplace completely different, that's very different from those two reports showing customer information coming from the same source, right? There's still overlaps in both cases. They're still potentially duplicative, but there might be duplicative in a different way and require a different remedy to resolve. Then you've got distribution details. So who's the report going to? Who's receiving that via email on a regular basis? Of course, that's very important. And then active usage, engagement, where people are going in and they're opening the report and they're taking a look at it. So you need to have all of this information, be able to pull all this information in order to effectively understand kind of a 360-degree view of the reports that you have in your environment, right? And if you complete that, so if you do that, then now you're in a position to be able to identify obsolete and unused reports, right? And to uncover the potentially duplicate reports. So obsolete and unused are obviously things that are not getting much usage out there. They're out there. Maybe they had usage 6-9 months ago. A better report has come out, and it's gets very little usage relative to the main report that should be used for that process. There's maybe some poor souls in the organization that are not aware of the fact that there is a better report and they're using some obsolete version. So that you look, usage information will tell you that, and then based on all of that metadata that we talked about, you can start working on uncovering potential duplicate reports, right? So what does that involve? Well, your report column metadata can tell you if there's an overlap across those columns. So if I have two reports and one report has 10 columns of data that's being presented to the user, and another report has maybe 8 columns that are presented to the user, but really all 8 of the original columns in the second report are present in the first report, well, that's a pretty safe bet that there's some kind of duplicate happening here. And those might have been created by totally different users, maybe even different groups, but it's a potential cleanup opportunity. So you look at to what degree do you have overlap in the columns that are being consumed within the reports by users, right? That's the key flag for duplicate detection. Another key indicator is looking at lineage. So where is there overlap across the tables and columns that are being referenced by a report? If I've got 2 Tableau reports, and if I look at the underlying SQL that's inside of those, and I see that in fact there's they're using the same set of fundamental tables and columns, then there's a good chance that there's an opportunity to consolidate those. Because again, this is how duplication happens, right? Two different users, maybe unaware of the fact that they're both working on this area, have built these reports. Maybe they're using slightly different logic to present the numbers. And now all of a sudden you've got overlapping reporting that creates confusion for users because they show different numbers. And then there's obviously core report metadata that provides a clue as well. So names, the descriptions, the key terms that are used in those. If there's a lot of overlap there, that's a potential flag to indicate that it might be part of a report cluster of duplicates. Right? So with that, all of that metadata, now we can do that analysis, and now we're in a position to delete and consolidate reporting in each tool, right? So we can really start cleaning it up, clean up the mess, take that, thousands of reports that you have, eliminate the 700 that are not used at all, look at the last 300, eliminate those down to maybe that can be consolidated down to 50 or 100 or 150 that really represent unique reports that do not have overlapping and duplication. And then if you've done that, now if you've cleaned that up and you've done that across the different the portfolio reporting that you have, right, across the different tools that are present, then you're ready to put it in front of the user in a way that they can consume it. Now, this is very important. We talked about the fact, the garden model, or another way to think of it as a museum model. You want your reports to be presented to users in a governed environment, which needs to be a BI portal or a catalog, or a mechanism where your users are consuming only the good stuff, and they're consuming it in a way that they're seeing all that information in context. And we'll give you a lot more details about in a moment, but remember the idea of seeing related metadata, understanding glossary terms and definitions, knowing when there's alerts or things that indicate there's data quality. All of that should be consumed with the report. Much the way that when you go to a museum, you look at a beautiful piece of art on the wall, you have that little placard that explains, what does that art represent, what was the artist trying to do, etc. This is the analogous analogy to that in the BI space, right? Give me all the context I need when I consume the data. And then once I've got this, now I've got to do that continuous process of weeding, right? I've got this beautiful garden now. Everything is great. But if I allow that to just drift over time, some of those reports are going to become obsolete. There are going to be new reports that are not included. So you need to have a workflow where you look at monitoring usage, and you look at unused reports that have gone through the initial vetting, but over time they start becoming unused. You have to be deprecated. Of course, new reports have to be added as well as new reports come in from the business that are all of a sudden active enough to be promoted, maybe, and so forth. Then you need to be able to monitor reports and flag additional duplicates. So if you've got a set of pristine reports out there, that's great. But if somebody out there in the organization starts building a report that looks largely similar to this one that's already out there, you want that user to know that, hey, heads up, you looks like you're building a report, and that's duplicate. And maybe you don't even realize that it's a duplicate because you don't have access to the report that's already exists around this particular area. It's a potential duplicate. You might want to go and reach out to the other analyst who's building that report. You might want to ask them to get access to that so you can take a look, and maybe you make a modification to their report to extend it for your use case, rather than going to build out something that is going to be a complete duplicate. And this, by the way, is also a huge area of wasted effort in organizations. If you look at your organization and you see what's being built, and then most organizations, if they really do an audit and say, well, how many things did people build that were not net new, but were actually things that were kind of derivative on things that already existed, but they didn't use the original existing content. It's sort of alarming how much of wasted effort goes into these, duplicative undertakings. Then you want to onboard new reports via a publishing workflow, via some kind of a workflow mechanism where you can then know that as you're promoting content, it's gone through a vetting process, that it is the right content, that it is certified, that it does have the right metadata. And then you report on the overall workflow over time. So you're monitoring this as at least as kind of enterprise or COE layer. You want to make sure that you have the ability to keep a track of how is this going, how are things being promoted, are you bringing the right content in, and so on and so forth. So how does this work in Metric Insights? Let me kind of walk you conceptually through this, and then Mike will show you, just give you some idea of what we're doing on the product side in more detail through a demo. Right. So first of all, at Metric Insights, we are a BI catalog. So we are that rationalization that was presented to the user, right? But to get content into the catalog, you need to go through a BI ops process internally within your organization. The first step is you into the catalog, you into the metric insights, we operate through a set of plugins that natively connect to all the different BI tools that are out there. Tableau, Power BI, Click, MicroStrategy, you name it, right? And we can collect the metadata from those tools. So we know what is the full inventory of the reports that are out there. In those cases where there are APIs available to be able to get columns and lineage and all that, we can collect that. We can collect tagging information, etc., and inventory all that in our metadata, right? Then as part of this BI ops layer, we can integrate with metadata that you might have not within the tools themselves, but in your data catalog. So that might be glossary definitions, it might be PII data, right? So if you can say, if you know that in your BI tool you're using that this particular report is using a particular table, and then that table is flagged in your data catalog as containing PII data, now we know that that report contains PII data. Right. And then the same thing applies for glossary definitions. You've got enterprise KPIs and they're defined at the table level, and we can map them through lineage to the particular reports that use that table. Then we can infer and present to the user that these KPIs are consumed by within that report. So this data catalog integration enriches, as part of the BI ops workflow, enriches all of the information so that that information can be present to users. Then the next step is then creating that catalog, right? And there we have to integrate with LDAP or Active Directory to be able to sync things up so that the security model comes in and everything is correctly accessible to users without reproducing the security model. So there's a security model integration that's part of the solution as well. And then the next step is enabling discoverability of this content through search. So that includes sort of classic search that's available, keyword type search, but also available through LLM type capabilities, a concierge product that allows you to have just a natural language question and answer type interaction to search for content. And now you're searching across all that content that you've published to the catalog through your BI ops process, or you've winnowed down that list to just the things that you want to include. You publish it to the catalog. You are then, it's part of in the concierge layer, allows you to discover that content through just by asking questions and having a conversation or chat conversation with through the portal or through Teams or Slack or any place else that users might consume that content. So making it accessible. And then the final step is presenting this information to users in a persona-based UX. So you may have thousands of reports out there, which is great. You've cleaned it up, but as a user, I probably don't want to see all of them. I want to see the ones that are relevant for me, or maybe I want to have discoverability for some of the other ones, but I want to be able to consume it. I want to consume it in a way that allows me to quickly get to value in all my reporting. So a key part of the portal solution is creating a persona-based UX that gets me to value quickly across that pristine set of content, all presented with the metadata that's been enriched in the environment. So with that, let me hand this off to Mike, and he can show you a bit of how this actually works in real life.
Yeah, thanks, Marius. So I'm going to take some of that last slide that Marius showed with the sort of architecture there and kind of focus more on sort of the first few stages around the BI ops piece and the cleanup, and then we'll touch on some of the catalog pieces as well, kind of how that materializes for the end users. But what you're looking at here is, so I'm sharing an instance of metric insights here. So, as we said in that sort of architecture side, logical architecture side, the first piece of any implementation is about connecting to the key tools in your environment, obviously. So in our world, it's about setting up what we call data sources through the plugin architecture that we spoke about, where we can connect to a particular BI or reporting tool that we're interested, as we said before, in collecting metadata from. So what does that look like? Well, if we take Tableau as an example, effectively a data source is connecting to a particular instance of that technology. So in this case, we're connecting to a Tableau server that's running in our environment. It may be restricting to a particular area on that application. So in this case, we're focusing on a particular Tableau site where we know that's really where users are accessing our content, and that's where they go to access it. Our plugins obviously have to authenticate against that particular technology. And that's dependent on the technology. In this case, we're just using a service account to connect to Tableau here. But the net result is when we make a connection, is that we're then able to go and start understanding what our plugin is effectively doing is that metadata piece that Marius spoke about. So it's going out and it's connecting to this site in Tableau in this case. It's looking at all the content that's available on that particular site. It's ingesting metadata around that content, everything Marius spoke about, from usage to lineage to names, descriptions, tagging, so that we've got sort of this library of metadata that we can now start to use further into the process. So again, whether we're looking at Tableau, and we'll use this as the example, Power BI, whatever the reporting tool is, the first step is setting up those connections so that we can start to track and ingest that metadata. And obviously, this isn't a one-time thing, as Marius said. As new content is getting created, it's coming into the fold here and being made available to the Metric Insights platform. So kind of the next step is if you think back to the flow that Marius covered in the slide and the steps that we're going through. So we've collected metadata from probably multiple sources. And what we can start doing now is looking at a cleanup exercise that really takes sort of two perspectives. One is, first off, let's get rid of what I would call the junk, basically the unused and obsolete content. And one way of potentially identifying that is just looking at usage of a particular of all the reports and dashboards. So, whether that's 60, 90-day ongoing usage views of a particular report. Let's this view will do, well, it will start to highlight those reports that aren't getting any usage. So let's go through the screen in a bit more detail. So what you're looking at here is down the left-hand side in this tree structure is each of these sort of high-level folders is a data source that we've connected to. So this top one is that Tableau one that I was just showing you, where we're going against a particular site within Tableau. We may have multiple sites, we may have multiple tools. We've got Power BI down here as well. And the structure under this high-level folder is representative of what how you've organized content in that tool. So, in the Tableau world, multiple projects here with workbooks and worksheets in those projects. In Power BI, it might be apps or work groups, whatever it might be. Folders on MicroStrategy. It's going to be representative of the structure that you have in that underlying tool. The number that you're seeing there is highlighting the number of again potentially, or the number of unused and therefore potentially obsolete content that's in each of those areas. So as we drill into this in a bit more detail. So each of these is at this lowest level in this world is a workbook within Tableau. We can see that 3 of those are actually being unused in this particular project. That means, again, we've picked up usage, and that both usage and distribution wise, no one is receiving this in their email in the last 60 days. No one has accessed this within Tableau in the last 60 days. Down the bottom here, I've got a bit more detail about these unused reports. So, when they were created, who created them, the last time they were viewed, who viewed them last time, the last time they were updated, ultimately who does have access to them and which groups have access to them, or which individual users have access to these reports, even though they're not looking at them. We've also got the lineage available here. So if I do want to drill in a little bit more and say, okay, what's this report, showing me, where's the data coming from for this report? What our plugins are doing, as we said before, is it's picking up that lineage through the tools. So what you're looking at here is, this particular workbook is being sourced by a number of databases ultimately downstream, and a number of tables or views within those databases is feeding the data source behind this particular Tableau workbook. So I can get some context around what it is. And ultimately, excuse me, ultimately, as we identify this potentially obsolete content, we can also, start to take action on this. So, what does that look like? Well, it may be that I want to assign this directly to the owner or someone responsible for this particular asset, and get them to basically take a call on it and say, okay, is this something that we want to remove? Is it important? And we should be figuring out what we do with it. So unused content is sort of the first piece. So let's start to tidy up and deprecate anything that is not relevant anymore. The second thing then is saying, okay, for what's left, as Marius said, a lot of these environments end up having duplicative content, whether it's because we got multiple versions of the same report, whether it's because, again, two people have basically created similar things. And we can maybe get away with just keeping one and maintaining one. We can start to use the metadata to flag potential duplicates. So what you're looking at here now is, again, on the left-hand side in the tree structure, you're seeing the different data sources. Within that, you're seeing the organizational paradigm for those data sources. In this case, rather than unused content, what we're seeing is potential, what I would call sort of clusters of potential duplicates. So you'll see here we've got actually 6 reports which have been flagged as a cluster and flagged as potential duplicates. And when we identify a cluster, we'll talk about the metadata in a minute that helps us do that. We'll also try and identify sort of what we'll call the main report in that cluster. And that's in terms of which one of these potential duplicates is getting the most usage today. And it's this detailed analysis report at the top. And then these are potential duplicates of that main report that are getting less usage. However, we've flagged them as having overlapping metadata. Down the bottom here, again, you'll see the some more detailed on those reports. So again, created by when they were created, looking at the usage over 90 days in this case, who has access to them again, the lineage as we spoke about before. Obviously, if you have some knowledge about this report, this set of reports here, this cluster of reports, it may be that actually, one of these other reports should be considered maybe the main thing in the cluster because we created a new version of it. And even though it's not getting as much usage yet, this is the one that we kind of want to benchmark against. And this is the one we know is the key one we want our users looking at. And let's look at potential duplicates as it relates to this one. So you can change sort of that key report within the cluster. I can then go and start to say, okay, let's look at these potential duplicates as they compare to this main report. So I can do things like pick version 2 and the original version here. I can compare the reports. So I can bring up sort of a side-by-side view here, so I can see exactly what these sort of reports are showing me. So I've got some context beyond just sort of the name. And I can also compare the metadata for these reports that we've been talking about. So if I come up here and I'm comparing now sort of the detailed analysis, the main report against one of the duplicates that I've picked. And what this table is showing me is potential overlaps within the metadata. So at the top, we've got sort of that core metadata, names, descriptions, who created it, when it was created, users who have access to it, groups who have access to it. I could bring up the lineage again here. And then as we move into these different tables, Marius spoke about these sort of different categories of metadata. So what are the columns within these two reports? and you can see that there's some overlap in terms of they're both showing sales rep information, they're both showing territory information, they're both showing the percentage attainment number. The first report is showing it by product. The second report is showing some close information. There is some overlap in terms of the report metadata. Also shows that they're both using the same filter. In this case, in the Tableau workbook. So territory is used as a filter within each of these reports. And down the bottom, in the bottom table, we've got lineage overlap. So this is saying, that they're both based on a set of tables that have a set of columns within them. And again, within those tables and those columns, there's a level of overlap in terms of what data is getting pulled and where it's being pulled from the underlying data source. So they're both going against tables that contain rep name, territory name, and it's coming from the same place into these different workbooks in Tableau. And then finally, there may be some additional metadata overlap. So, we pick up tags and glossary terms, as Marius said, potentially from Tableau or the data catalog. And again, is there overlap in these terms? So the idea is that we can start to, a high level look at the metadata, start to make some decisions about whether this is truly a potential duplicate that we may want to take action on. And, while they're not completely the same, we may be able to sort of combine or get away with using one of these rather than keeping both of them. And similarly to what we saw on the unused stuff, we could take some action on that. So it may be that we want to assign this to, one of the owners to say, do we think we can get away with just one of these, and have a basic workflow around the tidy up. It may be that at some point we decide that this report isn't a duplicate. It's actually something we need in addition to that main report, and therefore let's take it out of the cluster and deal with it separately. It's something that we're going to ultimately publish. So once we've started to tidy up the duplicates here, so we've removed obsolete content, we've started to tidy up duplicates and consolidate and rationalize what we have there. At some point, we want to take action in terms of publishing what's left into the idea of the BI catalog or the BI portal. So if I tidy up this group, this cluster, we're left with just sort of the main report here that we want to publish, I can publish that into a particular category within the portal or the catalog that we're going to look at in a minute. So I'm going to take this particular workbook and I'm going to publish it into the Metric Insights portal. So if we jump across to, let's go across to the catalog itself. And for those that have been on webinars in the past, some of this may be familiar to you, but this is kind of, taking it then into that sort of circular process within the slides that Marius spoke about. So we're cleaning up the different tools, rationalizing, and publishing content that we want now end users to access and see with context that we spoke about. So what you're looking at here, for those that haven't seen this, is again the Metric Insights catalog. Each of these tiles is a particular asset that we've now said, okay, this is legit, and we want to publish it for our end users. A tile is, if we take the Tableau example and continue there, is accessing a particular, in this case, workbook, where we're picking up again and making that metadata available to our end users so that they have the context. So you'll see, obviously names, descriptions, tags that we've spoken about, ownership, potentially glossary terms and definitions. So what metrics does this report contain? Who owns those definitions? All the stuff that's going to give me the context around what this particular Tableau workbook is and how it should be used, including, again, things like lineage that we were looking at before. So where is the data coming from that's feeding this particular report and dashboard that I'm looking at? So I've got confidence around that data. And so now as a user, I know I'm accessing a certified piece of content, a certified Tableau workbook. I know this is the one I should be using because any duplicates or obsolete content has already been tidied up. And within this portal environment, I can now access content in one place, regardless of the underlying source. So now I'm accessing the Tableau workbook embedded into the Metric Insights portal. And we've been obviously talking a lot about Tableau here, but the same goes, similarly, if I'm accessing a Power BI dashboard in the environment, it's the same scenario. There's metadata around it, there's lineage, I get the context. The only difference is when I click into this particular asset, obviously now it's rendering the Power BI dashboard in the middle there, and I'm accessing Power BI. Obviously, within the catalog, we're then organizing all this content together, regardless of source, in one way, in a category structure that's tied to your security, as Marius said. So Active Directory structures, LDAP structures, to make sure that users are seeing and searching through content and discovering content that you want them to discover. We showed sort of the publishing from the sort of the BI ops piece, publishing content directly into the catalog. Reality is, in a lot of cases, when that content gets published, it typically goes through an additional workflow where any additional sort of checks and balances can take place before it ultimately ends up as a tile within the Metric Insights catalog that we were just looking at. And so when I hit publish, typically something will get assigned to what we call a publishing workflow. Think of it sort of as a queue, if you like, and a sort of production line, where depending on the content and what it's showing, it can be going through sort of one or more steps of sort of a final checks and balances before it gets assigned into the catalog and certified. So what you're looking at here is, on the left is sort of step one, where content is being pushed to the catalog but being put in a queue. Different people then will be responsible for picking up reports in this queue. It may go through a number of sort of stakeholders. So, the analyst might get it initially to sign off on it and say, yes, this is the version of the report that I want to push out there. It may be reviewed by the business users who actually maybe, be responsible for adding additional metadata into it at this point that we're not able to capture from anywhere else. So maybe they're documenting it, or adding release notes or further definitions, or assigning additional ownership to it. That can be done as part of these publishing workflows. Maybe the governance team are signing off on it, but ultimately it's going to get sort of a level of certification depending on the type of workflow it's been, again, as sort of that final check before it gets published into the catalog and portal. And then, as Marius said, when we publish stuff in here and people are accessing it, we've got to keep weeding the garden, and we've got to keep on top of who is using what, and making sure that we continue to remove obsolete or duplicative content. And that happens in a number of ways. How do we identify whether something is still relevant or not? Well, we continue to track engagement with the content. So over time, again, we can see all these reports that get published. We can see, what's being used actively, what's coming in that's growing in popularity, but also what's starting to sort of hit its shelf life in terms of use and usefulness. So what's starting to decrease in popularity, and ultimately, again, what's getting unused within the catalog that we want to remove and take out so that we're not cluttering it up. And obviously, we track this usage. We keep track of all of it, and we can start to notify people when and the owners of this content when things are starting to go unused, so that again they can put it back into that BI ops piece, identify the obsolete stuff, and remove it from the catalog. One final thing, and then I see some questions coming in, so we'll move to those. As well as usage, as an indicator of whether something is still useful in the catalog. The other thing that you might want to do is start to capture feedback as well. And that can be sort of, subjective type feedback where we're capturing comments from users down the bottom right here, around how useful the report is or things they'd like to see. It can be ratings. So, is this something that you find useful? But ultimately, when it comes to sort of that review period for a report, if a report gets flagged as something that isn't getting used as much or is getting low ratings, we'll assign this to the owner and the person responsible for it. And ultimately, they can start to look at that engagement, see that it is starting to trail off, see the feedback that they're getting from users, and use that as a way of understanding whether this is something that we want to keep, and or is it something that we need to update or potentially retire. So hopefully that gives you sort of a sort of look into particularly the BI ops piece is probably new to some of some of you on the call here, and particularly around sort of the usage and capturing potential duplicates, flagging potential duplicates. But with that, I start to see some questions come in here, Marius. So maybe we can start to answer some of these if you want to come off mute.
Okay, I'm here. Do you want me
Uh,
to pick them off the list?
yeah, so first one, how much effort does it take to create a clean set of BI reports? I guess that's the million-dollar question, right? So maybe you can talk about sort of some of the things you see as organizations go through this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those. It's unfortunately, it's one of those questions that it depends is the answer,
Yeah.
because it's sort of like asking the question, "Hey, I've got a backyard with some weeds. How much effort it's going to take me to clean it up, right?" And that all depends on the amount of clutter that you have. How long has this environment been around? We've seen situations where people have tens of thousands of reports, or your organization may just have thousands of reports, right? And so it's different. I would say that the way to think about this is that you don't typically want to, at least at the enterprise level, you don't typically want to have like a single person or group responsible for all the cleanup. And instead, what you want to do is have a kind of federated model where there is a center of excellence that sets the ground rules, establishes how this is going to get done, and then engages with the analysts in the organization that are working on different areas to facilitate the whole process, right? So, Mike showed you can make make it accessible to people so they can see their content. You can make them responsible for certain areas of certain data sources, certain folders within data sources or projects if you've got Tableau, or workspaces if you've got Power BI, and whatever your nomenclature is, and then they go through it, and as a centralized group, you're really just kind of orchestrating the whole effort, right? Making sure that everyone's participating and working on it. Now, of course, if you've got a much smaller environment and it's a smaller BI team, then that can all be done centrally. But at the enterprise scale, typically this is a distributed effort, especially given the fact that you have to remember that it's not a one and done type of thing. The cleanup process, and it's very much, I mean, the weeding analogy is really good actually in this regard. And if you have a garden and you do like a few minutes of weeding every week, you get out there and kind of clean it. The weeding isn't very easy. If you let it go for months and months and months, it becomes a really big undertaking. So it's the same thing here. There's a big initial effort. It shouldn't be underestimated, but critically important. And the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be, right? Because the messier the environment gets and the less satisfied users are with consuming that environment. So it's one of those things that you just want to bite the bullet, look at it. We can help you kind of look at your specific situation and try to help you figure out what's involved based on your specifics, and then do it, and then have a process to clean it up on an ongoing basis.
Thanks. Can you, so how is the main report selected? What rules identify this, and are they customizable? I guess we're talking about sort of the duplicate clusters there, Marius.
Yeah, so currently we just use the report in a cluster that has the highest amount of usage. is the one that is identified by default as the main report, right? And then of course, as Mike showed you, you can, if you feel that a different report is the right one, a person managing looking through that cluster to figure out how to handle the duplicates, they can reassign that main different report as the main report. It can also remove things from the cluster if it turns out that, well, yes, there's overlap here, but there's actually a really good reason why you need both of those reports. Despite the overlap, you can decluster them, and they can both become main reports. So that's possible. As far as additional algorithms, I think that's sort of more of a roadmap question that is a TBD, is based on customer demands in that area.
Yeah, there's a few questions around sort of the metadata piece, Marius, and I think they're kind of related, a lot of these questions. But I think this one sums it up quite well from Matthew here. So for capturing metadata on reports in other systems that don't have sort of simple API connectors, do you have a means for getting metadata from, say, a database, or consuming a data file and metadata? Maybe let's expand on that question as well. How do you think about metadata and what you can capture from different systems and the ways of capturing metadata?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a fun. There's a couple of different things that fold into that, right? So, when we look at metadata, that's a fairly wide encompassing thing, right? So you've got everything from tagging to basic metadata around names and descriptions, to lineage, to what columns are being used in reports, to glossary type information, certification, etc., right? So that's quite correct to say that it is not a one size fits all. Depending upon the BI tool or tools that you're using, you're going to have different metadata available. So on the one end, you might have something like a Tableau or Power BI, where we're able to get through the APIs extensive metadata. I think so Tableau, we can get the full SQL statement that's there, and by parsing it out, we know which tables and columns are being used based on the data source. In Power BI, we can, based on a data set that's being used, we know the information there. On the other end of the extreme, you may be user generated reports that are CSV files or Excels or things of that nature that are out there that have very little in the form of metadata, just ownership and names and tags and description. So it really depends based on what's there. And I think the idea is to use whatever information you have to make the best determination of what might be duplicative, and so and work with that to create the clearest picture possible. And then there's some manual review obviously required for a cluster to figure out what makes sense and what doesn't. And then there's a whole other aspect of it, which is you've got metadata coming in from your data catalog. And again, that depends on what data catalog you have, whether some data catalogs look at lineage, so then you've got that information that you can bring in, others don't. You have some data catalogs that are, your data catalog information may be attributed to the BI report directly, in which case it can be tied there. It might have to be tied in through the tables. So that question kind of, there's a whole onion there that has to be unpacked, and it's a longer discussion. But it is a custom tailored approach, in the sense that you've got to look at what you have in your ecosystem, and then come up with a strategy based on that, for what's going to be brought in, and then we have various mechanisms to bring that in.
And yeah, that could also be coming from metadata that you're storing in a database, or that you're capturing in a file somewhere that you want to upload to finish
Absolutely.
off
So we have
sort of
customers that,
Matthew's.
for example,
Yeah.
either they store in Calibra or store it somewhere else, and they push it into a database, and then we bring it in from there. So that is a very common use pattern. And sometimes it's user maintained. We have some customers where there's compliance. For example, there's a bank that has compliance information that has to be user collected around certain compliance areas, and that's kept in a SharePoint list, and we bring it in from that, or it has to be keyed in through a system. So there are all mechanisms, everything from automated to manually keyed in through workflow, to a BI catalog automatic integration, to BI tool automated integration, that are all possible as part of the solution.
Okay, how are we doing for time? We've got a couple more minutes. There's a lot of questions here, so if we don't get to your question, I'm trying to look for sort of common ones here. We'll certainly follow up and answer directly. Um, let's see what we've got here. Can you delete? I mean, it's specific to Tableau, this question, but is it possible to delete a report from Metric Insights directly if it's not used anymore?
We don't currently do that. There are some APIs that that might be exposable over time. We obviously want to be very careful about touching the BI system. You can imagine somebody, making changes that don't realize exactly what they're doing. So currently, in the current version of the BI solution, the idea is that we flag what you have to do. You can have a workflow to put it in, and then you go to the actual underlying tool to delete it or remove it. It's possible to extend in that direction based on APIs, but we're going to do that based on, very carefully based on what we're seeing in terms of customer demand in that area.
Question about, I guess, two parts to this question. So does this work with, and there's a list of bunch of tools, SaaS, Click Cloud, Tableau Cloud, etc. So, and is it different if it's in the cloud versus on-premise? Not really. Again, we have a library of plugins that are connecting to, multiple products, whether it's cloud or on-premise. We have a big plugin team as well who are building out new plugins for customers all the time. So that's an ever-growing library of things. But first part of this question, Marius, is about, do we provide sort of guidelines or best practices for sort of tagging content and setting metadata? I guess we do at sort of a high level, right? What sorts of metadata should you be thinking about? But I don't know whether you got any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, there isn't like a one size fits all, because every organization has its own constraints. Obviously the key thing is what you want to capture metadata in the place where it is easiest for your users to capture it, and and as a system of record, so that you can maximize that capture, assuming that you can then integrate it downstream into the overall fabric of the solution, right? So we're very much like Switzerland in this regard, and we're not opinionated about whether you capture that metadata in Metric Insights, whether you capture it in the BI tool, whether you capture it in the catalog. Some organizations have multiple catalogs for various reasons. So there's not the what is best practice can vary based on the specific organizational needs and constraints, and just how this functions and who's doing the work. The more important thing is to look at and formulate a strategy kind of going into this that makes sure that all of the critical information you need from those pillars that we talked about at the beginning is being captured somewhere, and that it is being integrated into the final solution that people are looking at. And that's really and then let the rest of the stuff sort of fall out of that solution based on the specific strategy that makes most sense in your ecosystem.
So I'm just looking. Someone asked whether we can share all the questions and answers afterwards. We can absolutely do that. We'll put those together as we share the recording as well as this. And again, there's lots here. We've probably got time for maybe one more here. There's a lot of questions about there's some questions around, what level of metadata can we get from a particular tool. We'll follow that up on that directly. Question here about capturing usage. We showed that sort of decreasing, increasing usage. Is it separated? And taking frequency into consideration, quarterly and monthly reports. Yeah, so we capture usage at the report and at the user level, and we have the metadata typically around those reports, the monthly reports, quarterly reports, that sort of thing. But so that is taken into account. But really, we're looking at sort of the change in usage over time for a particular period. So, obviously a quarterly report is not getting looked at daily. So we're looking at the change in usage quarter over quarter, month over month, day over day, depending on the frequency. I think that's what that is getting at. Okay, so we're pretty much at the top of the hour here. Thank you everyone for your engagement and your questions, all good questions. We will follow up. We'll share the Q&A afterwards. But thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Marius, for joining us as well. And look out for a follow-up with the recording and the info that we've spoken about.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for spending time with us.
Thanks, everyone.